Hello and welcome to the Haaretz Podcast. I'm Allison Kaplan-Summer in Tel Aviv. The U.S.-Israel-Iran war is entering its third week, officially stretching longer than the 12-day war with Iran last June. Even in Israel, it's clear that what happens next, how long it continues, is in the hands of one man, U.S. President Donald Trump. As the New York Times put it, Trump, quote, faces a stark choice: stay in the battle to achieve the dauntingly ambitious goals he has set, or try to extract himself from an expanding and intensifying conflict that is generating damaging military, diplomatic, and economic shockwaves. Both of those options are deeply problematic and politically costly. In the United States, the level of lack of support for this war is historic. In every poll, a majority of Americans disapprove of the military action. Depending on the poll, support ranges between 27% to 44%. And by contrast, in Israel, despite the fact that we're paying a higher price for the war, not in oil prices, but in deadly missile attacks, it's a mirror image. According to polls, a large majority of Israelis, 81%, still support the war. If you look at only Jewish Israelis, it's even higher, over 92%. On the podcast with me to discuss that disparity and where it puts American Jews who support Israel and what Trump's wisest move would be given the complex realities is a Middle East foreign policy expert who knows the U.S.-Israel relationship well and has been in the rooms in the White House and the Pentagon where decisions are made at the highest levels regarding Iran, Israel, and the rest of the region. Dan Shapiro served as U.S. ambassador to Israel during the Obama administration for more than 5 years, between 2011 and 2017. Before that, he was senior director for the Middle East and North Africa on the White House National Security Council. And more recently, in the Biden administration, he served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for the Middle East. My conversation with Dan Shapiro is coming up.
I'm Esther Solomon, Editor-in-Chief of Haaretz English. Around the world, the fight is on to preserve critical and independent media. Haaretz, Israel's oldest newspaper, upholds its long tradition of accurate, committed, and incisive journalism, refusing to bend its reporting to pressure from any government or leader. A digital subscription to Haaretz gives you up-to-the-minute news and analysis in English from journalists who live Israel's reality and are committed to covering the Middle East and its global repercussions.
Ambassador Dan Shapiro, welcome to the Haaretz Podcast.
Thanks, Allison. It's great to be back with you.
Dan, the U.S. and Israeli attacks on Iran and the expected response of Iranian missile attacks on Israel caught you on a visit here a few weeks ago. Can you tell me what your experience was like? And was an attack by Iranian ballistic missiles on Israel the kind of scenario that was something you were prepared for back when you were ambassador?
So I was in Israel. Actually, my wife and I were both there. She had work and I did as well, and we had other business. And in fact, she decided when Ambassador Huckabee made the announcement to embassy staff that they should leave that Friday to try to get out that night. She did. I was going to stay a bit longer. And then, of course, the next morning was the first siren. So I moved from a hotel in Tel Aviv to friends near you in Ra'anana, where there was a good mamad, and ended up staying about 6 more days. So experienced, I don't know, the first 40 or 50 of those sirens. And look, it's never comfortable to feel like someone's shooting ballistic missiles at you. Israelis know that certainly better than anybody. But I think there was a good feeling, and it's been borne out, that the Israeli air defenses, buttressed by American air defenses, the THAAD and the offshore naval vessels that have ballistic missile defense capabilities, have largely held and largely been able to protect Israeli citizens from the worst effects of those attacks. There have been 12 or 13 deaths, of course, very tragic, and some other injuries and damage. But it's something that is one of the legacies, really, of a decade or two, some of which I was involved with, of helping to fuse the U.S. and the Israeli missile defense programs, do lots of training, get ready for major events, which, of course, we had in 2024 when Iran attacked. And And it appears that those defenses, at least until now, are holding. And so it was not pleasant. I was able to leave on that Friday, the first Friday of the war, through Jordan and fly out. I've been thinking, of course, every day about Israeli friends who are still, like you, who are still going to the shelters every day and unfortunately every night.
Dan, you've written clearly. You've made it pretty clear to the world your position that President Trump, more than 2 weeks after the beginning of this war, needs to find an off-ramp sooner rather than later. You've written, you've tweeted that he needs to declare victory and go home, basically. Why do you say so? Why do you fear for the future if this continues longer, more weeks, increasingly for months? And can you explain what exactly is the off-ramp that you suggest?
President Trump really does need to find an off-ramp, and I think it's actually a bit later than he should have already tried to find it. I mean, look, militarily, Iran is no match for the power of the U.S. and Israeli militaries, and we've seen that with the combined campaign, incredibly coordinated and integrated campaign by these two peer militaries. It's actually incredibly impressive. And that's done great damage to Iran's leadership, of course, eliminating the Ayatollah and many others on the first day, its missile stocks and production capability and launchers, several of its nuclear sites, its navy, its air defenses, other regime targets. So these were the military objectives that the U.S. commanders described in the opening days of the war, and there's not that much left to do on that. But the weaker party has cards to play, and actually their cards in some ways grow more influential as this conflict drags on. And we're seeing that. They're expanding the playing field. They've shot hundreds, maybe thousands now, of drones at the Gulf states, including increasingly at their oil infrastructure. They're draining U.S. and Gulf and maybe Israeli air defense assets as well. They haven't even fully activated maybe their asymmetric threats, the proxies. The Houthis aren't involved yet, terrorist attacks. But clearly, we're already seeing this major economic pain, global economic pain, coming from the shutdown of the Strait of Hormuz. So this is Iran playing the long game. And it seems to me that President Trump, who has said he could claim victory at any time, should do so. He can say, look, we hit their leadership. We killed the Ayatollah. There's a much less impressive person now in that role. We've largely destroyed or degraded anyway their ability to project power through ballistic missiles and launchers and production of those equipment. We have the nuclear sites hit again. The Navy has basically been disintegrated, and we've hit these other regime targets hard. And we've left the regime much weaker. It's much harder for them to threaten their neighbors, to suppress their own people. And they know what we're capable of, and they're deterred. And if required, of course, we would continue to act to prevent a nuclear breakout. We have additional means to do that. And we're open to talks with the leadership, the new leadership, on a peaceful dismantling of their nuclear program, if that can be done. And we'll shift our focus to helping the Iranian people in non-kinetic ways in their quest for freedom and for their nation. Now, that's not a perfect ending to this war, but guess what? There are no perfect endings to war. They end messy. And the notion that there's going to be this unconditional surrender, that Iran is just going to say, we're giving up, we're going home, we're handing the keys to somebody else, is not borne out by any historical example. We haven't ever seen regime change produced through air power alone. And in the meantime, that global economic catastrophe is just getting started. And if it goes another 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 4 weeks, I think we will all feel pain unlike what we have even seen until now.
Can it be framed as a victory, though, if it hasn't met any of the major goals? Like you said, no toppling of the regime, not really any popular protests back in the streets, and the 60% enriched uranium that the regime is holding has not been captured. Can it be called a victory?
Well, partly that is the problem of a campaign that was launched without clear strategic objectives. On the first day, President Trump, who never really addressed the American people about this or Congress about this, in fact, it happened in the middle of the night, U.S. time on Friday night, Saturday that week. And I know most Americans woke up the next morning and said, what? We're at war in the Middle East? They were very surprised. They didn't understand why. Why now? What was imminent? What was required? Was this the right strategy? What was the strategy? What was the goal? And he was very confused about that. He said at the time, yes, we're going to soften up the regime so much that then the Iranian people can come to the streets and take their country back. But the military leaders, General Kane and Admiral Cooper from CENTCOM, have been very clear. They are focused on discrete military tasks, just degrading the missile capability, launchers and production sites, and obviously stocks. And the same with the drone production capabilities and nuclear targets and the Navy and the air defenses. And they have largely done that. So if you just go by what the military said was the tasks they were given, this has been achieved. But it has not been, and it won't be, a full unconditional surrender. There still requires additional deterrence, additional threat management, probably some additional diplomacy and support for the Iranian people to get to those next phases of managing the nuclear problem, which obviously has to be managed and ultimately dismantled, and hopefully helping the Iranian people find their way to a better future. But 4 more weeks or probably 4 more months of this kind of campaign is not going to achieve those goals that you mentioned. Now, there is discussion, I should just mention, of whether or not the U.S. will put ground troops into Iran. This I know there is virtually no support for in the United States of America. Of course, the war itself has very low support for a foreign conflict. We're much lower than we've seen before, in the 30%, 40% range, not even that original rally around the flag effect you sometimes get, where most Americans do not want to have regime change wars in the Middle East. The president himself long campaigned against those wars from Iraq and Afghanistan. But certainly, if we're talking about putting ground troops in and the additional risk and the additional time and cost and resources that will require, and of course, probably lives that will cost, that's going to, I think, be even more unpopular. But we have 3 things being discussed about possible ground troops coming in. One is to seize Card Island, the oil export terminal for Iraq. Another is to put troops, maybe this Marine Expedition Unit that's on its way from Japan, along the coast to try to protect the Strait of Hormuz. And the third is a special operations force to go in to seize the nuclear materials. Now, all of those, I don't know if any of those are actually going to happen or on the table, but they're all being discussed. And that suggests we could be in this war for weeks to months rather than have something that you could wind up and accomplish what you most needed to now, and then work on a strategy to deal with those other threats later.
Bluntly, Dan, do you believe that initiating this assault, this war in conjunction with Israel was the right decision for the United States and a good idea? And do you feel very differently about what happened this time around than you did about Operation Midnight Hammer back in June?
Right. So first of all, I recognize that the Israeli view of Iran is that it is an existential threat, and it should be. I agree with that. Obviously, the Iranian leaders have called for Israel's destruction for decades, and they've armed proxies to carry out terrorist attacks with much Israeli blood on their hands. And they have sought nuclear weapons and ballistic missiles that could do tremendous harm, even existential harm to Israel. But of course, it is not an existential threat to the United States. And there was nothing imminent about a threat from Israel, from Iran to the United States. So there was a war of choice here for the President of the United States, rather than for Israel, and with none of the preparation you should have done or should have seen a president take in. So it was unwise to go in with that level of planning and that lack of clarity about what the objectives are. So my view about it is not against military strikes against Iran, but not this war and not this way. You know, Prime Minister Netanyahu went to Mar-a-Lago in December, and he explained to the president that after the successful strikes against the nuclear sites last June, including Operation Midnight Hammer. And I want to emphasize, I supported both the Israeli and the U.S. Operation at that time. And I certainly could have supported a short, sharp strike in January after the president said, when the protesters were in the streets, we have your back. And if their regime cracks down on the protesters, we will respond. That I think I also could have supported. But when the prime minister said, you know, there's this additional threat of ballistic missiles, if they produce as many as they're talking about, up to 10,000 or so, that itself becomes a strategic threat. And we have to deal with that. I could definitely understand that as well. There are all kinds of ways the United States could help facilitate later this year an Israeli effort to dismantle that threat, just as we did help Israel facilitate their response to the Iranian attack in October of 2024. But once these things got all tied up into a ball, the ballistic missile threat, the lingering nuclear unsettled issue of where is the HEU, the protests and the threat President Trump made in response to that process, this turned into, when the president launched it in his mind, a regime change war. I want regime change. I want this regime to disappear. I've wanted that for a very long time, but not through a military campaign. That's not really something we're capable of at any acceptable cost. We have a bad history of that and no support for it in the United States. And Trump did nothing to get that support. He didn't go to the American people and explain, what are we doing? Why are we doing it? Why is it necessary for it to do it now? And he didn't do anything to get any international support for it. Obviously, there's a U.S.-Israel coalition here, which is, as I said, incredibly impressive in military terms. But now we're finding ourselves in some trouble. We need some help securing the flow of oil and gas through the Strait of Hormuz. And now he is calling for other nations to send ships to help do that policing of the strait. But of course, if you want your allies with you when you get into trouble, you actually consult with them beforehand, find out what their interests are, which probably shouldn't spend the first year of your presidency denigrating them and calling into question our commitments to them, as he's done to our NATO and our Asian allies.
Imposing tariffs.
And imposing tariffs, sure. And so now we are finding ourselves in having bit off something that's quite difficult to swallow and potentially gets very, very disruptive, not just to our own interests and our own military readiness and other theaters. And frankly, it's empowering our adversaries, Russia and China, but where we might need some help. But there was none of that preparation done as well. So I'm not against military action against Iran. I absolutely understand and certainly felt it during those first 6 days of the war in Israel, why Israelis see this as necessary, an ongoing struggle against an existential threat, and a moment maybe of opportunity when there was some weakness. But that doesn't mean it's the United States' interest to launch what is essentially a regime change war this way at this time and with this lack of preparation.
As you said, a serious divergence of war aims between the United States and Israel, which, I would say from the leadership to the grassroots says, yeah, let's cause as much damage as we can to Iranian capabilities. And with the involvement of Hezbollah, it's also an opportunity to try to degrade their capabilities as much as possible. And now there's talk of a ground invasion by Israel into Lebanon, as the United States talks about a possibility of a ground entrance into Iran. And here we've got opposition leaders like Yair Golan already warning against a ground invasion. And so now there's a Lebanon scramble, a reported French proposal to get Lebanon to open diplomatic relations in Israel in exchange for Israel holding its fire. Are you looking at what's going on in Lebanon? And what do you think?
Well, yeah, to your point, Alison, I mean, there is a divergence of U.S. and Israeli interests here. I think that's undeniable. And we should just be open about that. It's okay that close friends with common and highly overlapping interests do not have identical interests. I completely understand, as already stated, Israeli support for this war. And I was in Israel. And so I even sort of share that perspective. But I completely understand for most Americans, the lack of clarity and therefore the lack of support for what we're doing, why we're doing it now. Is this the right way to address this threat? Could it have been done smarter? Could it have been done at lower cost? Is it worth the cost? We've lost 13 American service members' lives, and we are burning through very important military assets, air defense assets, naval readiness, personnel readiness and training that will affect our ability to address threats in the Indo-Pacific from China, that will affect our ability, if the president even still cares about this, to help support Ukraine in its war against Russia. And so I'm absolutely clear that there are divergent U.S. and Israeli interests here, and that's okay. We should be honest about that. Now, one of those is Lebanon, right? It is absolutely understandable that Lebanon is, and the ongoing threat of Hezbollah, which we're seeing, and there were sirens also from those rockets when I was still in Israel, needs to be addressed. And the Lebanese government has not lived up to the terms of the ceasefire from 2024 to fully disarm Hezbollah. And that is something that has to be addressed. I expect that even if Trump, which I think he will do at some point, call off the war in Iran, even if it's before Israel would like to, because I think Israel probably wants to press on to regime change, if possible. It's going to try to. It's weakening, trying to hit the siege and IRGC targets to weaken their ability to suppress the people. But at some point, Trump is going to have had enough. Israel will probably have to stop this kind of campaign in Iran at that time, but will probably then continue to pursue its own interests in Lebanon. Now, maybe that military campaign can be leveraged with this diplomatic initiative to get the Lebanese government and Lebanese armed forces to actually step up and take the responsibilities they need to. Also, we will together, the United States and Israel, have to continue to work on addressing the nuclear materials that are still in Iran. Exactly whose possession they're in is less clear, but that cannot be just left to question whether or not they still have that breakout capability. There are also some interests I think Israel doesn't, they just don't resonate as much for Israel that really should for the United States, which is if the regime falls, what happens on the day after, right? Any change in some ways is preferable because this regime has been so terrible and cruel and destabilizing. But what could follow could be a great deal of chaos, a great deal of spillover of instability to neighboring countries, a great deal of perhaps a civil war even among different groups in Iran. It could produce waves of terror outside of Iran, not the same kind that we've seen with the Iranian proxies, but something else. It could produce waves of migration into Europe, much as the Syrian civil war did with a much smaller country. That's going to affect the stability of Europe, affect the stability of our Gulf partners as well. And all of that has the potential to suck the United States in much further to the whole region. I could imagine that this is not a high concern for Israelis, that Israelis could live with that set of concerns in ways that the United States and the American people will maybe feel differently about and certainly have not been prepared
You
for.
don't see this as a real crisis or breaking point? You talk calmly about our divergence of interests. Your former colleague, Ilan Goldenberg, he's with J Street now. He wrote a piece where he asked the rhetorical question, how can you be pro-Israel and oppose the war with Iran when Israelis so overwhelmingly support it? To me, this looks like the biggest break between mainstream Democratic center-left America and even center-left and left Israelis since the battle over the JCPOA. You don't find it concerning?
Well, of course, I want to see as close alignment as possible about our interests, but I'm just trying to evaluate the factual situation here, is that for addressing Iranian threats, much of which Israel can do on its own, but should do with support from and facilitation by the United States. In fact, I was part of those operations when I was serving in the Pentagon in 2024, both the defense of Israel from the Iranian attacks in April and October of 2024, and the facilitation of the Israeli response to those attacks, particularly the one in October of 2024. If that is required, and obviously in extremis for a nuclear threat, as last June with Operation Midnight Hammer, I think these are very plausible roles for the United States to play. But it would certainly be possible to help support Israel addressing the threats it faces, such as this expanded ballistic missile threat, without committing the United States military and potentially putting at risk the global economy for a major extended U.S. regime change war of choice in the Middle East. And yes, if that means that there's a difference of view between American citizens and American Jewish citizens and center-left Americans, but by the way, plenty of right-wing Americans are asking a lot of these questions as well. Friends of Israel on both sides of the aisle. That's the case. That doesn't mean it's a rupture in the relationship. It shouldn't be. I wouldn't favor that at all. But it does mean that we have to be open and honest. And I think what's going to happen, I think President Trump is going to reach a point when the costs are high enough and the gains are high enough. He can, as I said, declare victory. I think, frankly, he could have done this last week, and it actually would have been easier then than it will be going forward, particularly because we don't know if the Iranians will respond to his claim of victory and calling it off by actually ending their closure of the Strait of Hormuz or ending their fire of drones into the Gulf. But I think it's going to happen, that the president himself will declare victory, declare that we've achieved what was necessary, and it will be before most Israelis would feel that they are satisfied with the outcome, which means there will be unfinished business. I don't have any doubt that in that scenario, both of us will have to continue to work on the nuclear issue and perhaps other threats that Iran could still pose. That's a fact of two countries positioned differently with different global or regional responsibilities and roles and obviously resources. And I just think trying to pretend it's otherwise is just denying reality.
Trump says he'll end the war when he feels it in his bones, so we'll all have to wait for that.
That's war by impulse and improvisation, not by strategy.
So from what you see, does Donald Trump and his administration Do they know what they're doing in this war? Have they totally lost control? Did they not anticipate, misjudge the Iranian response to the attack?
I think it's been very, very concerning how this war has been conducted. As I said, the military objectives which the generals describe are clear. The missiles, the drones, the manufacturing of those, nuclear sites, the Navy, the air defense, and Iran's ability to project power. And I said, Israel may have some other objectives. But when I said a moment ago, it's war by impulse and improvisation and not by strategy, that's what I'm talking about. No one really knows. President Trump, certainly based on the phone calls he's doing with reporters almost every day, multiple reporters, and saying very different things to them. I could end the war tomorrow. It's going to go 4 more weeks. We've already won. Well, there's a bit more we have to do. What are we doing? He's been so unclear about that, and this notion he can, he'll feel it in his bones is really sort of shocking way of describing it. There has to be a strategy here and clear objectives, and I don't feel it. I feel they have misjudged Iran. I think the president was seduced by his own success with Operation Midnight Hammer, a one-night strike on the Fordo nuclear enrichment site, which, again, I supported, maybe by the successful extraction of Maduro from Venezuela. He likes these short, sharp, one-and-done military engagements. He'd spoken against the longer and deeper engagements, but I think he misjudged the Iranians, that they would just roll over. They didn't and they won't. The weaker party has cards to play even in a conflict like this, and both based on ideology and, frankly, the fact that this is now a war of survival, not just for the regime itself, but for the individual members of the regime. The hundreds of thousands of men under arms in the IRGC and the Basij are basically now fighting for their personal survival as well as the regime's survival. It means that there was no likelihood that they were just going to roll over when the regime was decapitated, and very unlikely there was going to be what he had been pining for in the early days of the war, a Venezuela option, that some regime figure would emerge like Delcy Rodriguez in Venezuela and just become his agent, basically as part of the same regime. It does appear, while the military has been planning for dealing with a potential Iranian attempt to close the Strait of Hormuz for decades, there was no real preparation at the political level for how to deal with that situation. No diplomatic preparation, no speaking to allies, no ensuring we were properly resourced. And now he's begging other countries to get involved. And today he even threatened NATO. It's not going to go very well for NATO in the future if they don't come and rescue us from this problem we've gotten ourselves into. And maybe they should. But this is not how you prepare for a war that can go less than perfectly, as almost every war does, once you get involved in it.
Dan, as an American Jew, how concerned are you about the popular narrative that the U.S. has been drawn into an unpopular war on Israel's behalf? We had Marco Rubio at the beginning of the war saying, we knew there was going to be an Israeli action. We knew that would precipitate an attack against American forces, sort of hinting at that. And Bernie Sanders saying out loud, the U.S. cannot continue to be complicit in Netanyahu's wars. And I guess I should ask you, is there any grain of truth in the accusation that Israel dragged the U.S. into this war?
I know that Prime Minister Netanyahu has argued for many years that military action against Iran would be required. He certainly did while I was serving as ambassador, and he has more recently. And so he's encouraged it before. He encouraged it last June in the 12-day war and Operation Midnight Hammer. But that's his position. He's arguing, as he understands Israel's interests. A decision to go to war is the decision of the President of the United States. He owns that decision. That's his responsibility. And it's not appropriate to be pointing fingers at any other actor. I think Secretary Rubio made a terrible mistake saying what you described, that, well, Israel was going to attack Iran and then Iran was going to attack us, so we had to preempt by attacking Iran first. He tried to walk it back the next day. First of all, I don't think any of that is true. He tried to walk it back the next day, but that's a bell you can't fully unring. And so it is kind of rocket fuel for anti-Israel sentiment and to some degree anti-Semitism that we hear on both sides of the aisle about people who are uncomfortable about why we're doing this and can easily turn to that as the explanation. And look, if the war goes on for a very long time, not just a couple of weeks, but many weeks or months, if it goes badly, if the United States suffers terrible losses in blood and treasure, if we're expending huge resources that leaves us unprepared for other contingencies in Taiwan, or we see Russia gaining the upper hand, or if we see, frankly, a global recession, which is not out of the question, that affects everyone. Yeah, look, at some point, I expect people will point to Rubio's statement and they'll say, yeah, it was Israel's fault, or maybe it was the Jews' fault, and they caused this. So I don't think that's a helpful thing at all. I just don't think it's a factual thing. The President of the United States owns these decisions, and he will therefore own the consequences of those decisions.
Dan, you posted on your X account a New York Times article headline, Jared Kushner solicits funds for his firm while working as Mideast envoy. And you commented, it turns out you can just do things, illegal, unethical things. Care to expand on that point? On one hand, Kushner has definitely made things happen in the Middle East. On the other hand, there's that. Also, Steve Witkoff, we know, has some economic interests happening for himself in the Middle East. What do you think of all this as a career diplomat?
I've given Jared Kushner credit for a number of things that he's been part of in the Middle East, certainly the Abraham Accords. And I think his involvement helped secure the hostage deal last fall. I frankly think it was important that he got involved when he did. But we now have a kind of crazy situation. Here's a person who's obviously a family member of the President of the United States, who's deeply engaged in business activities and now currently raising money from business with and raising money from major governments with whom we have diplomatic business and now military business to conduct in the Middle East. He's actually not, as I understand it, appointed to any U.S. government position. I don't know if he has a security clearance that would enable him to have access to classified information. So either he's conducting negotiations on Iran and on Russia and Ukraine and on Gaza without access to classified information, which if he doesn't have a clearance is the correct thing, or he's getting access to that information, which is the not correct thing. So there's a lot of things that are not right about this, right? He's a person with skills and with relationships, and if those can be drawn on for the benefit of the United States, that's fine. But while that's going on, he shouldn't be also engaged in personal business activities from which he and his family benefit.
Dan, finally, as someone who's been involved in U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East for decades, you and I are both old enough to remember the post-9/11 atmosphere. Do you believe the comparisons being made between this war and American involvement and its mistakes in Iraq and Afghanistan are apt comparisons, or do you think people are comparing apples and oranges?
I don't think they're identical situations, and therefore I don't think the mistakes that are being made, and there are mistakes being made, are identical. So far, we're not doing a ground invasion. Now, frankly, it was necessary to do a ground invasion in Afghanistan after 9/11. It was a mistake to do it in Iraq. In both cases, the mistake that followed was getting stuck too long. But I think, frankly, the main mistake was thinking that we could remake those societies and that we had a sufficient influence and sufficient leverage to the determiner of the direction of governance and societal development. And that, I think, was a very big mistake. And that's a mistake that I think is a common thread here. This idea that we, through a certain amount of military force, so far without ground forces, we'll see if that continues to be the case, are going to be the determiner of whether or not this regime falls, about whether or not the Iranian people who desperately want this regime to fall will come about and make that happen. I think that's a big mistake. And so what we're heading for the derivative mistakes of an excessive expenditure of critical resources, of military capacity that will diminish our ability to protect our interests in broader strategic arenas. That's definitely a common thread. In this case, there's maybe an economic risk that we didn't even see in the wars of Afghanistan and Iraq because of the potential closure of the Strait of Hormuz over a period of time. Presidents have to make hard decisions and don't always have perfect information. And it's much easier, of course, to look in retrospect and say, this should have been done, this shouldn't have been done. I think we all should try to learn the lessons of history. It doesn't mean we should overlearn them. It doesn't mean every current situation has a clear historical parallel. When the president himself campaigned rather vociferously as a critic of the Iraq War, as a candidate and then president who said he would not get the United States involved in Middle East regime change wars of choice, things that would cost us if we got overextended here in this region and therefore hurt us in many other dimensions, hurt our even ability to attend to our very significant economic and social needs at home, which is really what he was elected to deal with. I think we have a right and a reason as American citizens to say this doesn't sound right to us. We want a rethink. We want a reconsideration of this. This is the right course. Again, I say that as somebody who, you mentioned my long history in this arena, has nothing but the highest disdain for this Iranian regime and appreciation for the very, very significant threat it poses, obviously to Israel, but to other partners, to us, to our interests, our allies, and all the blood on its hands from all over the region. I want the regime gone yesterday, but that doesn't mean this is the right way to go about it.
Ambassador Dan Shapiro, thank you so much for coming on the podcast and answering all of these questions fully and extensively. Wish us all safety and that this conflict will somehow come to an end.
I hope so, and definitely, please be safe, you, all your colleagues, your family, and everybody listening. I want everybody in Israel, hopefully, to be totally safe as however long this lasts.
Thanks so much, Dan. And that's it for this episode of the Haaretz Podcast. Thanks to my guest, Dan Shapiro, and producer Eli Shimoni, and editor Adi Shacham. If you'd like to continue to listen to this podcast and make sure you never miss an episode, please subscribe to us on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. And don't forget to leave us a comment or a 5-star rating, and that way more people can find us. And to keep up with all of the updates on the U.S.-Israel-Iran war, along with all of the other news on Israel, the Middle East, and the Jewish world, don't forget to subscribe to and follow Haaretz.com. I'm Alison Kaplan-Summer, and until next time, shalom from Tel Aviv.